Morning. Notice I didn't say good morning. Make up your own mind. You're being tired of being told what to think, right? That's one of the issues here. And by the way, I was hesitant about coming down here because I wasn't sure I could get a flight back to Canada because of all those Americans escaping the Trump regime. And of course, we kind of owe you because we sent you Justin Bieber and Celine Dion, so you got some credit with us on that particular issue. Very interesting comment made by the Prime Minister of Britain, Theresa May. She said, if you're a citizen of the world, you're a citizen of nowhere. And that's a very interesting comment about what's going on in the world, because regionalism and people looking after their own area rather than the global agenda is taking place at the political level. So what's going on right now is very interesting. When I was a young teenager in England, by the way, my name's Dr. Tim Ball, and thank you. I'm a climatologist with a PhD from the Queen Mary College, the University of London, England. I'm also a veteran. I served 9 years in the Canadian Air Force, 4 years chasing Russian submarines around the North Atlantic. Nobody ever told us what we'd do if we caught one. We always thought we'd call Ottawa and get a busy signal. The other thing I did was 5 years of search and rescue in the Arctic, which was a marvelous opportunity, an incredible chance to see a part of the world that very few people ever see. I lost my flying category because of hearing problems, and I got out of the military, and I thought I'll pursue a career in climate because that's a nice, quiet, non-political area. And so here I am before you today. One of the things that, as a young person in England, there was a joke that I kind of got the sense of and humor of, but as time went on, I realized that more and more the significance of it. And the joke was about a guy at Hyde Park Corner, which was the only place in England where you could speak your mind and attack the government. And you got your soapbox and you stood on your wooden soapbox and you could say whatever you wanted. So this fellow's there saying, come the revolution, we're going to do this, and come the revolution, we're going to do that. And he goes through all of these lists of freedoms that you're going to have. And then he says, come the revolution, we'll all wear shirts and ties. And a voice at the back of the crowd says, but I don't want to wear a shirt and a tie. And the guy on the soapbox says, come the revolution, you'll do what you're bloody well told. I now realize the significance of that joke. And so we're going to talk about human-caused global warming. Some people call it a hoax. It's not a hoax. A hoax has a humorous side to it. Hoaxes are designed to prick pomposity. So if you want to make somebody who's standing out too much, you just show how stupid they are. This is a deception on a global scale. It's the greatest deception in history because there have been deceptions in the past, but this is the first one on a global scale that affects every single person and every single thing. So it really is the greatest deception in history. And what I want to talk to you about is how it came about. Before we get to that, one of the things that President Obama has done, and I'm telling you this as somebody from outside of the United States, is he's convinced the world that American exceptionalism means that Americans think they're superior to everybody else. You and I know that's not true. What American exceptionalism is about is of course, the document, the Constitution that you've evolved. And just to give you an idea, of course, the very first thing is free speech. You're the only country in the world that has that as their number one issue. There's no other country that has free speech. And let me illustrate the point to you. I've got 3 lawsuits on my hands right now, all of them brought by a same lawyer, all about things that I had said about climate change. One of them was from Michael Mann, the creator of the hockey stick. And I gave a presentation in Winnipeg where I explained to the public what he'd done and how he cooked the data and refused to release his data. And afterwards, I was interviewed by a media person, and they said, well, what do you think about Michael Mann? And I, with my flippant humor said, well, he's at Penn State, but maybe he should be at State Penn. Within 9 hours, I had a lawsuit on my hands. And so far, it's cost me $1.5 million in legal fees. So if you want to talk about the price of free speech, look at any other country in the world and you'll see it. Because those lawsuits would not have been allowed in the United States, based on what I said. Okay? And so what I've got is a lawsuit filed by somebody from Pennsylvania for something I said in Manitoba, Canada, that's filed in a British Columbia lawsuit. So you want to start talking about free speech. And of course, the founding fathers knew how critical it was because they knew that your government was likely to be curtailing it. So they gave you the Second Amendment to defend the First Amendment, right? Thank you. And then the other thing is that the private ownership of land. No, America's the only place in the world that has legislation where an individual citizen can privately own land. And I get angry when people talk about Magna Carta. And I say, oh, well, it was all about private ownership. No, it wasn't. Magna Carta was Prince Charles complaining to the Queen that she's not treating him right. All of the peasants back on their land were still serfs. So it was only when America was formed that the individual citizen had the right to private ownership of land. And of course, as you know, that's under attack with your Land Bureau management and so on, the attacks on that freedom. And we are in now the last phase of the American Revolution. And the last phase of the American Revolution is the access to information. Because people in power know that if you can control the information flow, you can control the people. And what's happened with the internet is that has allowed the individual citizen access to information that they could never previously get. Of course, the people that want total control, and Obama with his net neutrality is trying to shut that down. And that's something you're going to have to watch very carefully, is the government taking control of the internet. Because as I said, that's critical to the whole situation. I wanted to show you this idea of degrees of freedom. This is from statistics. In statistics, the number of degrees of freedom is the number of values in the final calculation of a statistic that are free to vary. I want you to apply this to the human condition. See, because if two people decide to get together, they agree to give up certain freedoms because they figure that together they're going to get more important freedoms to them. But what happens is every time you add another person to that group, each individual loses freedoms. So you see at the bottom there, you go from total freedom of the individual, the bigger the group, the less freedoms that you have. So, of course, that concept is what is all about limiting the size of a population or a government or anything else. So it's built into that statistical idea. I talked about the mainstream media. This is a poem by William Cooper, and it's called The Progress of Error, 1782. How shall I speak of thee, thy power address, thou God of our idolatry, the press? By thee religion, liberty, and laws exert their influence and advance their cause. By thee worse plagues than Pharaoh's land befell, diffused made earth the vestibule of hell. And I love this line, thou fountain at which drink the good and wise, thou ever bubbling spring of endless lies. This is 1782. It hasn't changed, right? And the media are controlled by the power elites. And that's what this guy's talking about. And that's why I'm telling you the internet is bypassing all of that. And this is why I'm saying that what's going on right now is such a critical time. This is Michael Crichton, who, of course, Jurassic Park and so on. And Crichton was a medical doctor who did postdoctoral work in Oxford. He wrote a book called State of Fear, which I urge you all to read again, because it tells you how the environmental groups exploit fear and push their agenda. And this was at a speech in San Francisco. He said, I've been asked to talk about what I consider the most important challenge facing mankind, and I have a fundamental answer. The greatest challenge facing mankind is the challenge of distinguishing reality from fantasy, truth from propaganda. And that is a real challenge, even on the internet. And a couple of years ago, the fellow that discovered the missiles in Cuba from aerial photographs and so on. They asked him, would you like to be in the business today? And he said, no. They said, why not? He said, because with Adobe and all these other things, you can falsify images so that you can't tell the reality anymore, even in a visual image. So sorting out reality from truth has become very difficult, and we need to be teaching our young people how to do that, how to discriminate, how to sort out what is accurate and good information. We're not doing that. This is a study done by Yale University, and I apologize to Will for mentioning Yale in the presence of a Princetonian, but this was a high school test, grade 10, on climate change amongst the general public. So it was like they were writing a high school exam on climate. Look at the results. 77% failed. Now that's important because the public simply don't understand the science of climate change. Therefore, they are easily fooled. And that's what's been going on. And by the way, 80% of the population are art students, 20% are science students. So the gap is even greater. And so you see the problem that people have. That's why information is power. We should be teaching things in school that students need to understand the world, but we're not doing that. School has become an indoctrination, not an education. And one of the things that I'm talking about with my lawyers in my lawsuit is that it's not that long ago that in the universities, the old professors had the prevailing wisdom and the young professors came in and challenged it. Now the young ones are coming in with the indoctrinated views, and it's the old people that are saying, hey, hang on a minute. People like me and Fred Singer at 92 and Bill Gray at 86, they've completely flipped the whole process of the education approach upside down because of what they're doing in the schools with the indoctrination. I'm also writing another book right now called Environmentalists Are Destroying Environmentalism. See, society changes by paradigm shifts. You've heard that term. That is that suddenly we decide we're going to take a totally different view of something. And what happens with a paradigm shift, and environmentalism, of course, was one of these, is that the innovators look at it and see an opportunity to make money or get political power, and they grab it and they run with it. There's a few at the other end say, I'm never going to listen to that stuff. They're called the laggards. I love that. I love to be a laggard. I've never owned a pair of jeans, by the way, so I'm a laggard in the clothing department. Thank you. But of course, the problem is the people in the middle are saying, well, it sounds like a good idea, but how far do we go with it? And one of the things that I've struggled with throughout my career is, what is the role of an extremist in our society? And it finally dawned on me, the role of extremists is to define the limits for the majority. And let me give you an example of another paradigm shift that you've all gone through. Feminism, absolutely necessary. Still changes need to be made. But the majority of women were saying, well, how far do we go with this? And then the extremists come along and they, oh yeah, okay, now I know. Now I understand. They define the limits. Well, we're now getting to that point with the environmental thing because they're becoming so extreme with their claims that people are starting to say, no, hang on a minute. Now, they're still afraid to say that out publicly because, oh, you don't care about the planet or the children. There's still those threats. But the environmental extremism is starting to backfire. And of course, what's happened with it is that environmentalism has become a religion. It's taken on all the hallmarks of a blind belief, and particularly amongst the young people. Because one of the things that a lot of people don't realize is that science used Darwin to get rid of religion. Okay? That left a vacuum. And when you went to Oxford University in Darwin's day, there were 2 or 3 doors to the library, the Bodleian Library. There was the door to the natural sciences, the door to the humanities, and the door to the library. You go to any university today, the largest door is to the social sciences. And the social sciences emerged because once you get rid of God, you got to have some other explanation for why humans are here and why we're different than all the other animals. That's what the social sciences are doing. I call it human navel-gazing. Okay? And I love to tease my sociologist friends by saying, look, if you guys were any good, you'd be out of work by now. Right? And so you start to understand what the dynamics of what is going on. So as I said, we've got this the religion of environment. And by the way, just to illustrate how bad it's become, I was talking one day, and I used to deliberately try and get my students to react. You know, I'd annoy, poke their brains. And I said something, and this student suddenly blurted out, "I don't believe you." And of course, the whole class went rigid. The red pencil sword of Damocles was going to descend on that student, you know. And so I let the class calm down, and I said, "What don't you believe, Thomas?" The student said, "My name isn't Thomas." And I said, "I know." And how many in this class know the reference? 5 out of 300. So you start to see what's happening with environment. And of course, environment then fills a moral vacuum for them, right? The Mother Gaia and so on. So this is one of my heroes. This is one of the few world leaders to speak out against the climate issue. His name's Václav Klaus. He was the president of the Czech Republic. He was the keynote speaker at the first Heartland Conference on Climate in New York. And he stood up and he said, "We've just gone through 70 years of communism. Why the hell would you want to go back to that?" Sorry, it was such an emotional moment in my life. And of course, the audience applauded. Now, he wrote a book, which was the marvelous title, Blue Planet in Green Shackles. Okay? And the subtitle is, What is Endangered, Climate or Freedom? And that's what we're here to talk about today. He recognized it because he'd lived through communism. He saw what it did. And so, as I said, he's one of my heroes. Now, this is Thomas Malthus. And of course, Malthus wrote a book called, or an essay on the principle of population. The interesting thing is, and in that book he argued, by the way, that the population would outgrow the food supply. That's at the center of what's going on in the world today. And just to fill this in for you, Darwin took Malthus's book with him on the Beagle. And Darwin wrote in the book that this was the greatest influence on his thinking on the Darwinian theory of evolution. But Malthus was completely wrong. His theory was wrong, the evidence he used was wrong, but it was the principal influence upon Darwin. The other influence on Darwin was his cousin by the name of Francis Galton. And Galton was the guy that created the word eugenics. Too many people, got to control the people, got to reduce the numbers of people. Okay? So you see all of those things coming out of what Darwin was doing and what was going on in the 19th century. So Malthus, of course, then he said the population would outgrow the food supply. The Club of Rome formed and took that idea and said the population would outgrow all of the resources, not just the food supply. And that was the beginning of the problem, because the global warming and climate issue is really a secondary issue. The real issue is overpopulation of the earth. That the people that want to control the whole world think there are too many people. Reduce the numbers, you can control them more easily. And not only that, but they're using up the resources at an unacceptable rate. And of course, the Club of Rome here, and you see the top left, the round table, and you see the Club of Rome at the bottom of it. That is deliberately like a feudal structure, because that's what you're looking at, is feudalism applied on a political level. And the book, The First Global Revolution, that you see on the right, is the topics covered by this book include the need for the world to convert from a military to a civil economy, the recognition of the disastrous short-term effects of exploitation by first world countries. See, you evil first world countries, you're destroying the planet. We got to sort you out and bring you down to size. And of third world poverty and need, and the containment of global warming. So they mix all of these ideas of too many people, we got to control them, we got to shut down the industries and development, because they're destroying the planet, all comes from that Club of Rome book. And of course, Paul Ehrlich's book, The Population Bomb, how this guy is still at a university or has even listened to it all. Because in his book, he said, if I were a gambler, I would take even money that England would not even exist in the year 2000. I mean, he was so wrong, but he's still being preached in the school system. It's still being presented as one of the Gospels. He said the battle to feed all of humanity is over in the 1970s. The world will undergo famines. I mean, it's unbelievable what he was predicting. And yet, as I said, he's still being pushed and promoted as one of the great ideas of the 20th century. We can be reasonably sure that within the next quarter of a century, by 2000, mankind will be looking elsewhere than in oil wells for the main source of energy. And of course, you got Elon Musk wants to go to Mars, and I think that's a very appropriate ambition. And I think he should give away free seats to other people. But Ehrlich published a book with this guy, John Holdren, who, of course, is now Obama's science czar. And you see the book is called Ecoscience, Population, Resources, and Environment. And he has been the one that's pushing, like you hear polar vortex and all these things, that's coming from him. And it's all totally false scientific information. But I want to show you a quote that will explain to you how these things are brought about. Because in that book, he wrote, indeed, it has been concluded that compulsory population control laws, even including laws requiring compulsory abortion, could be sustained under the existing Constitution if the population crisis became sufficiently severe to endanger the society. That is scary stuff. I mean, that's eugenics and population control, where the government are saying, we can force you to have an abortion. And he's sitting in Obama's White House. Now, you don't change your spots. It's that simple. And of course, what I want you to notice with this is, look at how it's done. And I'll come back to this a bit later on. Indeed, it has been concluded. Who concluded it? They did. Right? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. And then at the end he says, it could be sustained under the Constitution if the population crisis became sufficiently severe to endanger the society. Who decides when it's sufficiently severe? They do. So they set up the straw man and they kill the straw man. They're in total control. But they're using the Constitution to do it. That's the way the game is played. And unless you understand how these people think and work and read this stuff, if people don't see the dangers in this stuff. Of course, the limits to growth was the idea that we're going to run out of every single resource. This is where the idea of peak oil began. And of course, then there was a bet made by Julian Simon. He bet Ehrlich. He said, pick any minerals you want, pick any length of time you want, and I'll bet you by the end of that time, that mineral will be more available and cheaper. Simon won the bet. Ehrlich asked Holdren to pick the minerals for him. He was absolutely wrong. So you can see the failures. But here's the real culprit, and I'm ashamed to say he's Canadian. This is Maurice Strong. Yeah, and I've talked to people that went to school with him, grew up with him, worked with him, and he left home at 15, which is fine, but he comes out of a very socialist background. His aunt, Anna Strong, declared herself a Marxist at the age of 15, and in the 1930s, she traveled to China where she had an affair with Mao Zedong. Maurice Strong himself died in China at the age of 85. Why was he in China at that age? Because the U.S. government wanted him for misuse of funds. And what was he doing? He was taking the oil for food in Iraq situation. You remember that? Where they said Iraq could sell some oil to feed their children. Strong and his son took the money and put it into bank accounts in South Korea. So when you start to look at what these people do, but he was asked in a book, he said, he speculated, what if a small group of those world leaders were to conclude the principal risk to the earth comes from the actions of the rich countries? In order to save the planet, group decides, isn't the only hope for the planet the industrialized civilization's collapse? Isn't it our responsibility to bring that about? And Elaine Dewar, that was interviewing him, said, well, why don't you run for politics? And he probably said the only honest thing he ever said in his life, because he said, you can't do anything as a politician. And she said, well, how are you going to put this into practice? He said, I'm going to go to the UN where I can get all the money I want and not be accountable to anybody. And that's exactly what he did. So and by the way, I love those there's sleeper comments. Conrad Black, I think a lot of you know that name, the Canadian that went to jail in Florida. They said to him one day, why aren't you in politics? He said, I don't need to be. That's one of the more you think about it, the implications of that comment. But this is what Elaine Dewar concluded after 5 days with Maurice Strong at the United Nations. Strong was using the UN as a platform to sell a global environment crisis and the global governance agenda. There it is. It's all laid out for you. And here's how he did it. He set up the United Nations Environment Program, the Rio Declaration of 1992, and then under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. The political side was Agenda 21, Conference of the Parties. That's the political group that meets to decide how much money they're going to spend on global warming and climate change. On the other side, they set up through the World Meteorological Organization, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Why did he use the WMO? Because it put the bureaucrats in total control of what was going on. See, and Mary McCarthy, the social commentator, said a few years ago, bureaucracy, the rule of nobody, the modern form of despotism. And that is so true. And Obama, of course, using the EPA and all the other bureaucracies. Notice that the Intergovernmental Panel reports to the Conference of the Parties. And when those emails were leaked from East Anglia at COP15 in Copenhagen, suddenly they were going to approve the Kyoto Protocol, and it all fell apart because the corrupted science had been exposed to the world. But here's how it's done. I used to think commissions of inquiry were great. Because you say, oh, there's a conflict, the politics, and finally they say, well, let's have a commission of inquiry. Let's get the politics out of the issue. That's what I thought till I got appointed to my first commission of inquiry. And it was conflict over a large lake in Manitoba. And we got the terms of reference, and I looked at the terms of reference, and I said to the chairman, these terms of reference predetermine the outcome of our investigation, because that's what the politicians do. They go back to their office and through the bureaucrats give the commission very limited terms of reference. So you have no choice but to come to a certain conclusion. So I said to the chairman, you go tell the minister either we get complete access to everything or I'm going to tell the media that you're trying to control the outcome of this investigation. Well, once we got all the data, we suddenly discovered there had been 4 previous commissions of inquiry, all making the right recommendations, none of them acted on. And of course, the politicians love the commission of inquiry because the minute it's appointed and the media come with their, well, what do you think? I can't talk about it. The commission's looking at it. So they're off the hook. By the way, that's where most conspiracy theories start. I was watching Judge Warren. It was the Kennedy investigation, right? Assassination. And they said to him, well, why didn't you look at the mafia connection in Dallas with Jack Ruby? And Warren just very calmly said, it wasn't in my terms of reference. I knew what he was saying, but most of the public, it just, okay? In other words, he had been told, don't go there. And what is one of the biggest conspiracy theories on the net right now? Who killed Kennedy, right? That's what's going on there. Okay. Well, here's how Maurice Strong controlled the climate issue. Here's the definition that he gave to the IPCC: a change of climate which is attributed directly or indirectly to human activity. So in other words, don't look at what nature's doing, only look at what humans are doing. And of course, the thing is, you can't determine human effect unless you know the amount and cause of natural climate change. We haven't got a clue. But he limited what they could look at. And very few people know that. The public are led to believe they're looking at total climate change, and they're not, by any stretch of the imagination, as I'll show you just now. They only look at 5 variables: CO2, nitrous oxide, and halogens, and so on. And that's still, this is the most recent report, where they're still only looking at 5 variables. So it's like getting a 5,000-piece puzzle and saying, well, I've solved the puzzle with 5 pieces. That's what they're doing. That's how bad this is. It's absolutely amazing what they're getting away with. And the things they leave out, of course, the sun. Oh, no, you can't look at the sun. It's got nothing to do with the weather. Right? And that's why they don't have windows in weather offices. You know, they don't look out at what's going on outside. And this is called the Milankovitch effect. What it shows is the changes in the relationship of the sun-Earth. You can see at the bottom there, the bottom here, you see the orbit of the Earth is changing from almost circular as is now to a more extreme ellipse. And that's caused by the gravitational pull of the planet Jupiter. But what are we still teaching in the schools? That the orbit is a relatively fixed orbit. It's not at all. It changes dramatically. And of course, that causes a change in the climate. You can see at the top here the changes in the energy from the sun based on orbital change. The tilt of the Earth is constantly changing, and you can see that here. And then, of course, the date on which the precession or the equinoxes occur. Our calendars are fixed. Nature isn't. And every so often we have to bring our calendars up to date with what nature is doing. And in 1782, the British government added 11 days to the calendar. And people were outraged. There were riots in the street. You think you're angry at government. They figured they'd shorten their lives by 11 days. Okay? And I was teaching a course in the penitentiary near Winnipeg because I wanted to have a captive audience. And I said, you know, everybody was outraged about this shortening the year by 11 days. And one of the prisoners said, I know a group that weren't. It's all relative. Okay. So, and the bottom right-hand corner here, by the way, you can see the amount of variation caused by this effect. It's 100 watts per square kilometer. The effect of CO2 in total is 2 watts per square kilometer. So it's completely swamped by that, but they don't even that's not even in their computer models. None of this is in their computer models. Here's another thing. Will Happer talked about cloud cover, and the questions were asked about cloud cover. Well, we've known that there's a relationship between sunspots and temperature on Earth. The Chinese have known about it for 1,000 years, and I work with Chinese climatologists. They're way ahead of anybody else in what's going on in the climate. But in the year 2000, they discovered that the cosmic rays from the sun, the amount of them reaching the Earth is varied by the magnetic field of the sun. And as the magnetic field of the sun varies, the sunspot numbers vary and the low cloud cover varies. So in other words, that's a major control of climate, as Will Happer explained to you. And here you can see this is a plot of the cosmic radiation reaching the Earth, and here's the low cloud cover. Not even included in their computer models. And the questions that were asked about the influence of cloud upon the weather, you can see it there. Okay, sunspot numbers, we've been recording them since Galileo in 1610. The numbers were very low in what's called the Little Ice Age. So when you got low sunspot numbers, you got cold temperatures. And when you got more sunspots, you get warmer temperatures. So the warming out of the medieval warm period here is directly related to changes in cloud cover. This is a painting, the bottom here, a painting by Jan Griffier of London. This is in 1683, and you can see there's an ice fair going on the Thames River. The ice was 3 feet thick that year, okay? And you can see St. Paul's Cathedral here, Westminster Abbey. Some wag has said that because they built the Houses of Parliament right here, and since the parliamentarians started blabbering, the hot air has prevented the river from freezing over since. And about the only effect of politicians on global climate. And you can see right now, by the way, the sunspot numbers, we're at a low. Cycle 24, sunspot numbers are as low as they've been since 1800. That's why a lot of people are saying we're heading into a cooling period, but the world's preparing for warming. We're preparing for completely the wrong thing because of the false science. Okay, this is a systems diagram of the whole, and it's a simple diagram of the complexity of what is the weather. And notice that this is all they're looking at, CO2. They're ignoring all of the other variables. And one of the things that they're ignoring is precipitation. All the focus is on temperature, but for plant life and for humans, what the precipitation is going to do is far more important. And if you think the temperature data is lousy, the precipitation data is even worse. This is the greenhouse gases. I'll just show you this very quickly. Here's CO2, 4% of the total greenhouse gases. The most important greenhouse gas is water vapor. They effectively ignore it. And they say, well, don't humans produce water vapor? Yeah, we see that Will showed those chimney stacks and the vapor coming out of them. But they said, oh, well, the amount humans produce relative to the amount in the atmosphere is so small, we'll just ignore it. But the water vapor's only got to vary by 1% to counteract any warming of all of the CO2. So you're leaving out the most important greenhouse gas completely. And people in Phoenix know about this. What happens at this time of year with the clear skies, the heat escapes and the temperature goes down? That's water vapor as a greenhouse gas. So people are familiar with that. But of course, it doesn't suit their political agenda to put that in there. Okay, the hypothesis of anthropogenic global warming is that your assumption is only as good as your hypothesis is only as good as the assumptions you make. Okay, one of the things that's going on now in science, everybody knows Einstein's theory of relativity, the formula equals mc squared. The formula cannot be wrong. You don't try to prove the formula wrong. It's a mathematical result of the assumptions. What you try to do is show that the assumptions, one of which is nothing can go faster than the speed of light. Scientists now are saying we're measuring things going faster than the speed of light, which raises all sorts of questions about Einstein's theory of relativity. Okay? Now, I knew there were things that could go faster than the speed of light because I had children that could get to the bathroom when the dishes had to be done faster than the speed. Sorry, I shouldn't joke around too much. You lose credibility with humor, right? Sadly. Anyway, they assume that CO2 is a greenhouse gas that allows sunlight in but slows down the escape of heat, and Will showed you that. Okay, and they said a CO2 increase causes a temperature increase. That's the key thing. CO2 increases, temperature increase. Then they said CO2 will increase because of human industrial activity. Those are the assumptions that they built into their model. This came out in 1991, and I remember when the press conference that was held. This shows you the ice core temperature of 420,000 years, and it shows the blue and the red, so you got the temperature and the CO2. And of course, right away, everybody says, oh, look, they're going up and down together. 5 years after this came out, they showed that the temperature was changing before the CO2. In other words, the fundamental assumption of the whole human-caused global warming is wrong. In every single record we have, in every one of them, the temperature changes before the CO2. So, I mean, it's absolutely incredible that the most basic assumption is wrong. I won't spend much time on this. The models, the computer models are created by the grid system. It's actually a mathematical model. And then it's built up from the Earth in these rectangles. But look at the problem we've got. 85% of the Earth, we've got no data at all. 70% of the world, oceans, no data. 20% of the world's forests, no data. 19% of the world's deserts, no data. 19% of the world's grasslands, no data. And so above the surface, of course, we got even less. So what are the models built on? The models are built on what they call parameterization, which is guessing. We think this is what's going on in that square, okay? And I'll show you, this is how bad it got. They decided that if you had one station, that was representative of a 1,200-kilometer radius around it. So I drew this on a map here. So here you can see a station in Michigan, and if they use that station to represent the climate for that whole, everything within that ring. So you're putting climate from southern James Bay, which is subarctic, down to the Carolinas, which is subtropical, and they're claiming that the climate in that ring is all the same. That's what their computer models are built on. I get so apoplectic about this. It's unbelievable, the deception. Will Happer showed this. Of course, this is why their computer models are wrong. Because, of course, in their computer models, it's the only place in the world where the CO2 increase precedes a temperature increase. Right? Only place in their computer model. And by the way, what they do is they start the model at a fixed situation, they double CO2, and they run the model, they get a different result every time. So they average out the result of runs, so you create an average, and then they take 105 computer model averages and average those. So it's an average of an average. And if you know anything about statistics, averaging averages is just simply wrong. But anyway, this is what's going on. If your prediction is wrong, your science is wrong. They have been wrong with every prediction since 1990. They have not made one accurate prediction, and yet they're telling the world that you've got to introduce policy. Will Happer showed you this graph of the temperature increasing up to 1998 and then leveling off. Notice that what happened was this part of it contradicted their hypothesis because the temperature started leveling, but the CO2 continued to increase. This is what Thomas Huxley 100 years ago described as the great tragedy of science, a beautiful hypothesis destroyed by an ugly fact. Okay? And the ugly fact was that, as I said, the temperature leveled off, but the CO2 kept going out. What a proper scientist would do is, hey, my predictions are wrong, I'll go back and look at my science. They didn't do that. They moved the goalposts. They changed the terminology from global warming to climate change. Okay, a lot of people noticed that change. Okay, and that was deliberate because here from the leaked emails of East Anglia, a 2004 leaked email from the Climatic Research Unit, Mins Tyndall Center. Sorry, it's a bit slow here. It says, in my evidence, global warming forcing is already a bit of a public relations problem, okay? And the reply from the Swedish climate expert was, yeah, maybe we should start calling it climate change instead of global warming. This was all planned. The evidence doesn't fit, so we'll change the name. That's why it came about. This is corruption on an enormous level. In the Agenda 21, they have a list of principles. The use of the word principles is a bit loose. I mean, there's nothing principle about any of this. But this is the precautionary principle. And I want you to think back to the thing I showed you that John Holdren wrote about compulsory abortions. Because you see, what it says here is, in order to protect the environment, the precautionary approach shall be widely applied by states according to their abilities. See, now, the poor nations don't have to pay, but the rich nations have to pay. That's built right into it. And then it says, where there are threats of serious or irreversible damage, lack of full scientific certainty shall not be used as a reason for postponing cost-effective measures to prevent environmental degradation. Well, it's the same thing. I mean, who decides what's serious and irreversible? They do. Right? It's the same, what could we call it, circular reasoning going on here in that principle in Agenda 21. Okay? And then they had the problem of the medieval warm period. And again, Will showed you a little bit of this. But around the year 1000, the world was much warmer than it is today. The Vikings were sailing in Arctic waters that are now permanent pack ice. There are Viking residences in northern Quebec on the Ngava Peninsula. And I've read about the Vikings, Anne Ogilvy, and all her work on the climate data that she produced. But David Deming, who I've known for about 30 years, he said, with the publication of an article in Science in 1995, I gained significant credibility in the community of scientists working on climate change. They thought I was one of them, someone who would pervert science in the service of social and political causes. So one of them let his guard down. A major person working in the area of climate change and global warming sent me an astonishing email that said, we have to get rid of the medieval warm period. What do Marxists do? They rewrite history. That's what these guys are doing. They're rewriting climate history. And of course, what came out of that was, this was the graph that bothered them. And by the way, Hubert Lamb, who produced this, I had the privilege of working with him. He helped me with my doctoral thesis, and he was one of the earliest people looking at climate change. And it showed the medieval warm period, and then it showed the Little Ice Age, and it showed, well, the world's been warming since 1680. That was problematic to them. They had to get rid of this graph. And so a guy by the name of Michael Mann, who's the guy that's suing me for suggesting he should be in state pen, produced this graph. And here you can see that he levels it out. The medieval warm period's gone, the Little Ice Age is gone, and then he's tacked onto it this blade of the hockey stick. Okay, now, this is scientifically wrong because this is tree ring data and he's attached an instrumental record. You don't do that. That's scientifically incorrect. But it created this poster child of global warming. And so, but just let's look at that. So Mann's broad claim, he claimed when he was taken to court by Cuccinelli, the Attorney General of Virginia, who said, we want your data. We want to know how you produce this hockey stick graph. And Mann has refused to produce it, okay? One of the reasons that I chose to defend myself against Mann's charge, and in Canada, the only way I could defend myself against defamation is I could have said what I said was fair comment. But if I did that, I couldn't force into discovery to disclose documents, okay? But if I lost that case, the maximum fine I could get is maybe $10,000. But I could say, no, what I said was the truth. Then he's forced to disclose the information to me. But if I lose, they can take everything I own and they can fine me as much as they want. So there's a huge gamble in it. And that goes back to the free speech issue again, right? Which you Americans, a lot of don't appreciate. And so, and I just a quick point about this. I was in Bismarck, North Dakota a few years ago, and the former UN ambassador, U.S. ambassador, made a very profound speech, and I'll just do it very quickly. He said, look, in the next 60 years, what you're going to see going on in the world is a complete change of trade. He said, because if I sell you that pen, you have the pen, I no longer have the pen. There's a complete transferal of property. But if I sell you an idea, you have the idea, but I still have the idea. So the challenge for me is, and it's devalued therefore by 50%, right? And every time you sell an idea, it's devalued. So the challenge, he said, going forward is, how do you sell an idea and yet retain its value? And he said, you're going to see a growth of intellectual property rights. You're going to see a growth of all sorts of copyright and everything else. 25% of the TPP plan that Trump is abandoning is devoted to protecting rights and protecting the idea because of what that guy told me. And so you can see what's going on with the world. Mann went to court and claimed that he didn't have to disclose his information because it was his intellectual property. And Cuccinelli, the Attorney General of Virginia, said, hey, the taxpayer paid for your research. It belongs to them. And the court said no. And then Cuccinelli said, well, the data was used to fool the whole world. And the court said, no, sorry, it's his intellectual property. And of course, you know from your old math school exams, what was the standard instruction on a math exam? Show your work. Mann's refusing to show his work. And of course, we're going to bring all of that out at the trial. Okay, and so what man did was, of course, the hockey stick. Mark Stein, who's also going to give evidence at my trial, by the way, he wrote this book, A Disgrace to the Profession, and he got 100 climate experts around the world to comment on what man had done. I mean, can you imagine being a scientist, having a book published with that title about you? No. Well, yeah, Mark Stein is suing him because man sued Stein for something he said, and Stein immediately countersued. And again, the genius of the founding fathers, they said, we're going to stop this frivolous suits in the United States beyond the free speech thing, because what they created a constitutional tort that said if you're sued, you can immediately countersue. I can't do that in Canada. All I can do is go to the courts and have the case dismissed, but they won't dismiss it for 10 years. So you start to see the privileges you have and the subtleties and the wisdom of the founding fathers. Okay, so here, let's press on with this. The blade of the hockey stick is an instrumental temperature record for the 20th century, produced by Phil Jones. He claimed the global average surface temperature had increased by 0.6 degrees Celsius in 100 years, plus or minus 0.2. Now, a lot of you won't realize the implications of that, but if I show you that this is a range of 0.4, so the plus or minus 0.2 is a plus or minus 33% error factor in their number. I mean, you wouldn't even use that on a political poll. Right? But that's the blade of the hockey stick. More corrupted rubbish. Warwick Hughes asked Jones for the data that he used to create that blade of the hockey stick. And here's what Jones emailed back to him. We have 25 years or so invested in the work. Why should I make the data available to you when your aim is to try and find something wrong with it? I mean, this is a world-leading scientist putting this stuff up there. It's almost unbelievable. It's Alice in Wonderland. It really is incredible. Okay, I'll just show you this very quickly. Of course, Will Happer mentioned about the adjustment of data. One of the first challenges to government was in New Zealand. We brought a lawsuit against the government of New Zealand. Here's the actual data, the green, and here's the adjusted data. And of course, what it does is it increases the warming, and it shows the warming was far more severe than it was. So again, they've rewritten the record. Just to put this all in perspective, here's the global temperature right now. This is the global temperature over the last 10,000 years. Notice that it's been warmer for 9,000 of the last 10,000 years than it is today. But what are they telling you? It's warm as it's ever been. And of course, we've got empirical evidence because here's a photograph of a spruce tree north of the tree line, and that spruce tree radiocarbon dates at 5,000 years old. And you can see I plotted it here. The global temperature was probably 3 degrees Celsius warmer than it is today. The question you need to ask yourself is, how the heck did the polar bear survive all of this? Okay? And suddenly you start to put things in perspective. Okay, let's... The 97% figure that Obama kept quoting was also corrupted data. They took 11,944 papers, concluded 97% of them expressed an opinion supporting climate change. In fact, by their own definition, only 41 agreed with the definition. So the actual result is 0.3%. But Obama's going around saying 97%. That paper has now been withdrawn, and there are lawsuits against the Queensland professor in Australia that cooked up this data. Totally corrupted 97% data. But by the way, consensus has no place in science anyway. That's a political issue. It's not a scientific issue. Okay. It's better to say that 97% of scientists have never looked at the climate science. This is a quote from Klaus Eckhart Puls, a German meteorologist and physicist. And here's what he wrote. He said, 10 years ago, I simply parroted what the IPCC told us. One day, I started checking the facts and data. First, I started with a sense of doubt, but then I became outraged when I discovered that much of what the IPCC and the media were telling us was sheer nonsense, was not even supported by any scientific facts and measurements. To this day, I still feel shame that as a scientist, I made presentations of their science without checking it. That's an incredible statement. That's an incredible statement. And it's matched by this one, by the late Hal Lewis, who's professor of the American Physical Society. I suspect Will Happer knew him. But he wrote, the global warming scam, with the literally trillions of dollars driving it, that has corrupted so many scientists and has carried the American Physical Society before it like a rogue wave. It is the greatest and most successful pseudoscientific fraud I've seen in my life long as a physicist. You can't get more blunt than that. You simply cannot get more blunt than that. And so the amusing thing, I'm close to the end here, this is the demographic transition. We've known about this for a long time. That is that as a society becomes developed, the population rate starts to decline. And in fact, one of the great problems in the world is countries like Japan, where you're supposed to have 2.6 children per family to maintain the population. Japan is at 1.3 children per family. So you've got a much, much smaller, younger group supporting an increasingly older group. Now, in most countries of the world, they're offsetting that with migration. They're allowing immigrants in. That's what Germany's been doing, okay? And in some countries, they're paying parents to have more than 2 children. Italy is paying parents to have a 3rd child. Quebec is paying parents to have a 3rd child. But even there it's racist because they're only paying French Canadians to have a 3rd child. Okay, so you see all the games of this. Okay, so the demographic transition. So the best way to reduce the world population is to have development. That's the contradiction of everything that they're doing. And I'll just leave you with these 2 quotes. The people you're very familiar with, John Adams, I'm well aware of the toil and blood and treasure that will cost to maintain this declaration and support and defend these states. And then, of course, Jefferson, the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with blood of patriots and tyrants. And, of course, that's the challenge that you're faced with now. If you're interested in more of my views on these things, here's 2 books. This one, I had to write a lot of detail to keep the academics off my back. And by the way, I took early retirement because I said I had to retire. There was so much scar tissue on my back, there was nowhere to put a knife anymore. But this is the more recent publication, Humans Cause Global Warming. It's 100 pages. It's a PowerPoint with my lecture notes, so it's easy to follow. And it's done in the journalistic approach of who, what, where, when, and how. So it's a quick, easy, in-your-pocket read so that the public who are going to start asking questions, right? Because when we were in Australia recently, I had Tony Heller got up and said, look, here's how they cook the data. I got up and said, ask yourself why. And then I explained why. So the public are now going to start asking, how did they do this? Why did they do that? Why would scientists corrupt the data? And the answer is, of course, because of the political agenda and the funding. Those are the 2 things that have driven it. So with that, I thank you for entertaining me here. Thank you.